The chandelier above glittered like a constellation trapped in glass, casting shards of light across the ballroom of the Fairmont San Francisco. Edward Langston stood at the podium, his silver hair catching the glow, his voice steady as he unveiled Langston Innovations' latest triumph, a sleek, palm-sized device promising to revolutionize how the world connected. The crowd, tech moguls, investors, journalists, erupted in applause, their champagne flutes clinking in a symphony of approval. At 62, Edward was the picture of discipline, tailored suit sharp as a blade, posture unyielding, eyes scanning the room with the precision of a predator. This was his empire, built brick by brick over 3 decades, and tonight was its coronation. Then his phone buzzed. He ignored it at first, letting the vibration hum against his thigh as he nodded to the CFO's follow-up remarks. But it buzzed, again, insistent like a gnat that wouldn't be swatted away. With a subtle flick, he pulled it from his pocket, glancing at the screen under the podium's shadow. An unknown number, a voicemail notification. Edward's jaw tightened. He didn't tolerate interruptions. Not here. Not now. He pressed the device back into his pocket, forcing his focus to the sea of faces beaming up at him. Control was his currency, and he wouldn't squander it. The event wound down with handshakes and murmured promises of partnerships. Edward lingered near the bar, cradling a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched, when his assistant Margaret approached. Her usually composed face was taut, her voice low. "Mr. Langston, you have a call. It's urgent, from a hospital in Sacramento." Sacramento, his brow furrowed. He hadn't set foot there in decades, not since he'd left the dusty streets and the girl who'd begged him to stay. "Who is it?" They wouldn't say much, just that it's about a young man named Daniel. "He's in critical condition. Car accident. They found something with your name on it." Edward's grip on the glass tightened, the amber liquid trembling. "Daniel?" The name meant nothing to him. "Sounds like a scam. Tell them I'm not interested." Margaret hesitated, then handed him her tablet. "They sent this." On the screen was a grainy photo. A young man, late 20s, unconscious on a gurney, tubes snaking from his arms. His face, sharp cheekbones, dark hair curling over a pale forehead, was a mirror of Edward's own, 30 years ago. Beside the image, a scanned document, a birth certificate. Father, Edward Langston. The room tilted. Sound drained away, the clink of glasses, the hum of chatter, leaving only the thud of his pulse. He forced a breath, steadying himself against the bar. "This is nonsense," he said, his voice a low growl. "Anyone can fake a document. Tell them to handle it themselves." Margaret's eyes flickered with something, concern, maybe pity. But she nodded and stepped away. Edward turned back to the crowd, pasting on a smile as a venture capitalist approached with congratulations. Control. He could maintain it. He always had. But the bourbon stayed untouched. When he retreated to his office an hour later, a glass-walled sanctuary overlooking the bay, he couldn't shake the image. That face. Those eyes, closed but hauntingly familiar. He sank into his leather chair, the city's lights sprawling below like a map of his victories. The phone sat heavy in his pocket. Against his better judgment, he pulled it out and played. The voicemail. "Mr. Langston, this is Dr. Patel from Sacramento General. We have a patient, Daniel Carter, 28 years old, brought in after a severe collision. He's in a coma, critical. We found a birth certificate listing you as his father. We need to speak with you urgently. Please call." Edward cut it off, slamming the phone onto the desk. A scam. It had to be. He'd built Langston Innovations. From nothing. Sacrificed everything. Walked away from anyone who dared to hold him back. Clara's voice echoed faintly in his mind, 30 years distant. "Don't go, Edward. We could make it work." He'd left her standing on that porch in Sacramento, her hands clasped over her stomach, tears streaking her face. He'd chosen the dream over the girl. There'd been no child. She'd never said a word, had she? He stood, pacing to the window. The bay glittered, cold and indifferent. He was Edward Langston, untouchable, disciplined, a man who'd forged his name into the annals of Silicon Valley. No one could drag him back to a past he'd buried, but his hand betrayed him, reaching for the glass of water on his desk instead of the bourbon he craved. He drank, the coolness steadying his nerves, and stared at his reflection in the glass. Lines carved his face now, but the eyes, sharp, unyielding, were the same as that boy's. Margaret knocked softly, entering with a file. I had legal pull the hospital's records. The call's legitimate. The boy's mother is listed as Clara Carter. Does that name mean anything to you? Clara. The air thickened. Edward's mind flashed to her again. Her soft brown hair, the way she'd looked at him like he could be more than ambition. He'd walked away, told himself she'd move on. She had, apparently, with a son. His son? No, he lied, voice flat. It doesn't. Send them a check for the bills. That's all they'll get from me. Margaret lingered, her silence louder than words, then left. Edward sat again, the chair creaking under his weight. He picked up the bourbon, swirling it, watching the light fracture through the liquid. His hand hovered, then set it down untouched. He wouldn't let this unravel him, not some ghost from Sacramento, not a boy he'd never known. But as he stared, at the photo still glowing on Margaret's tablet, Daniel's face, his face, the cracks began to form, not in his empire, not in his reputation, but somewhere deeper, where control couldn't reach. He pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose, willing the tremor in his chest to still. The night stretched on, the city humming below, oblivious, to the bell that had tolled in Edward Langston's perfectly ordered world. The drive to Sacramento felt like a descent into a life Edward Langston had buried decades ago. The sleek black sedan cut through the night, its headlights slicing the fog that clung to Highway 80. Edward sat rigid in the back seat, his fingers drumming a silent rhythm on the armrest. He'd told Margaret to arrange the trip discreetly. No press. No fanfare. Just a quick visit to shut this nonsense down. The hospital's call had been a pebble in his shoe, irritating but manageable. He'd pay the bills, sign whatever papers they needed, and be back in San Francisco by dawn. Control was his forte, and he wouldn't let some ghost from the past steal it. Sacramento General loomed ahead, a squat brick building bathed in the sickly glow of sodium lights. Edward stepped out, the cold air biting through his wool coat. The lobby smelled of antiseptic and despair, a far cry from the polished marble of his world. A nurse led him through a maze of corridors to the ICU, her clipboard clutched like a shield. "He's in there," she said, nodding toward a glass-walled room. "His mother's with him." Edward paused at the threshold, steeling himself. The boy, Daniel, lay motionless on the bed, a tangle of tubes and wires anchoring him to life. His chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm with the ventilator's hiss. But it was the woman beside him who stopped Edward cold. Clara Carter. Her hair was grayer now, pulled into a tight bun. But those eyes, fierce, unyielding, were the same ones that had pleaded with him 30 years ago. She wore a faded nurse's uniform, her hands roughened by years of work, resting gently on Daniel's arm. She looked up, and the air thickened. "Edward," she said, her voice steady but laced with something raw. "You came." He straightened, forcing his tone to ice. "I'm here to settle this, Clara. Whatever it is." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She stood, stepping closer, her gaze locking with his. "Settle this? He's your son, Edward. He's dying, and you think you can settle it with a check?" Words hit like a slap, but Edward didn't flinch. He'd faced down boardrooms and hostile takeovers. He wouldn't crumble here. "I don't know what game you're playing," he said, low and even. "I left you 30 years ago. There was no child. You never told me." Clara's eyes flashed, but her voice stayed calm, cutting deeper for it. "I tried. You were too busy building your empire to listen. I was pregnant when you walked out that door. I begged you to stay, and you said—" She paused, swallowing hard. "You said you couldn't be tied down, so I raised him alone." Edward's mind reeled, dragging him back to that porch in Sacramento. Clara's hands on her stomach, her tears glistening in the dusk. He'd thought it was just emotion, a desperate plea to keep him. He'd turned away, climbed into his beat-up Chevy, and driven toward the future. No letters, no calls. He'd made sure of that. But her words now cracked something inside him, a fissure he couldn't seal. "You're lying," he said, though the conviction faltered. "If he's mine, why wait until now?" Clara stepped aside, gesturing to Daniel. "Look at him, Edward. Tell me he's not yours." He didn't want to look, but his eyes betrayed him. Daniel's face, sharp jaw, high cheekbones, the same dark brows that furrowed when Edward stared too long into his own reflection, was a mirror of his youth. The resemblance was undeniable, a punch to the gut he couldn't dodge. His throat tightened, but he forced it down, keeping his expression stone. "I'll cover the bills," he said, turning to leave. "That's all you'll get from me." Clara's voice stopped him cold. "I didn't raise him to need your money, Edward. I raised him to be better than you. But he deserves to know his father, even if it's just to see the man who walked away." The accusation hung heavy, a blade poised over his pride. Edward's hands clenched at his sides, but he didn't turn back. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him waver. "You should have moved on, Clara," he said, his voice a quiet blade of its own. "This isn't my burden." He walked out, the beep of the monitors fading behind him, but her words clung like damp air. The driver opened the car door and Edward slid inside, the leather cool against his back. He stared out the window as the hospital receded, its lights blurring into the fog. His reflection stared back from the glass. Older, harder, but still the man who'd left Clara standing alone. He'd built Langston Innovations on that choice, on the discipline to cut ties and forge ahead. No regrets. That was his mantra. Yet, the image of Daniel wouldn't leave. Those closed eyes, that fragile chest rising and falling. A son. His son. The thought was a splinter under his skin, sharp and persistent. He reached for his phone, thumb hovering over Margaret's number. He could have her dig deeper, confirm Clara's story, but he stopped. Confirmation meant responsibility, and he'd spent a lifetime avoiding that trap. The car rolled through the night, Sacramento's quiet streets a stark contrast to the glittering chaos of San Francisco. Edward leaned back, closing his eyes, willing the memory away. Clara's voice echoed, "He deserves to know his father." And for a moment he saw her again, young and hopeful, standing on that porch as he drove off. He'd told himself she'd be fine, that she didn't need him. But the boy on that bed said otherwise. His hand brushed the bourbon flask in his coat pocket, a habit from long nights at the office. He pulled it out, the silver glinting in the dim light, then set it on the seat beside him. Unopened. Control. He wouldn't let this unravel him. Not Clara, not Daniel, not the past. But as the car hummed toward the city, the weight of that unopened flask felt heavier than the empire he'd built. And in the silence, Edward Langston couldn't shake the face in the mirror, a face that wasn't just his own. Edward Langston returned to San Francisco under a sky bruised with dawn, the city's skyline a jagged crown against the horizon. The drive from Sacramento had been a silent penance, Clara's words looping in his mind like a scratched record. He deserves to know his father. He'd shoved them down, locked them behind the iron wall of his discipline. By the time he stepped into his penthouse office, the bay shimmering below, he was Edward Langston again, CEO, Titan, untouchable. The bourbon flask stayed in his coat pocket, unopened. Control was his anchor, and he wouldn't let it slip. But the world had other plans. By noon, the whispers began. A junior assistant darted past his desk with wide eyes, clutching a tablet. Margaret appeared moments later, her face a mask of calm stretched thin. "It's hit the wires," she said, sliding the device toward him. The headline blazed in bold. Langston Innovations CEO linked to dying son in scandalous secret. Below it, a blurry photo of Daniel on the gurney, followed by speculation. Illegitimate child, abandoned family, a fall from grace. Edward's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "Who leaked this?" "We're tracing it," Margaret replied. Could be the hospital, could be someone closer. The board's already asking questions. He waved her off, turning to the window. The bay glittered, indifferent to the storm brewing in his world. He'd faced crises before, market crashes, patent wars, and emerged unscathed. This was just noise. He'd kill the story with a press release, a generous donation to Sacramento General, a vague denial of involvement. Clean, efficient. But, as he scrolled the article, a comment caught his eye. Langston's empire is built on betrayal. What's a son to a man like that? The word stung, a barb under his skin, but he kept his face stone. Control, always control. The evening brought the real test. Langston Innovations was hosting a charity gala at the DeYoung Museum, a glittering affair of black ties and whispered deals. Edward arrived late, his tuxedo crisp, his smile a practiced blade. The room buzzed with the usual sycophants, tech barons, philanthropists, the elite who'd kiss his ring for a favor. But the air felt different, charged with sidelong glances and hushed tones. He caught fragments as he moved through the crowd. Did you hear? Some kid in Sacramento. Hypocrite. Then Vincent Pierce stepped into his path. The man was a shark in a bespoke suit, all teeth and ambition, a rival Edward had crushed years ago in a brutal takeover. Vincent raised his glass, his voice loud enough to carry. Edward, good to see you weathering the storm. I hear you've got a new heir, or is he just another loose end? The room stilled, eyes turning like spotlights. Edward's pulse quickened, but he met Vincent's gaze with ice. Careful, Vincent, he said, his tone smooth as glass. Your tongue's sharper than your business sense. We both know how that ended last time. A ripple of laughter broke the tension, but Vincent didn't flinch. He leaned closer, his smile venomous. Dan dukua an, Your Honor, Edward. It's just cheap paint peeling off a rusted frame. How long before the board sees it too? Edward's hand tightened around his champagne flute, the stem trembling for a heartbeat. He could feel the room watching, waiting for him to snap, to lash, out to prove Vincent right. But he wouldn't. He'd spent a lifetime mastering himself, turning rage into resolve. He set the glass down, untouched, and stepped forward, voice low. Say what you want, Vincent. The truth speaks louder than your cheap shots. It always will. Vincent smirked, but Edward turned away, cutting through the crowd with deliberate calm. The whispers followed, a chorus of doubt nipping at his heels. He excused himself to the balcony, the night air cool against his skin. Below, Golden Gate Park stretched dark and quiet, a stark contrast to the gilded chaos inside. He gripped the railing, knuckles whitening, and forced a slow breath. The stock ticker on his phone blinked red. Langston shares down 5% since noon. The board would demand answers, investors would pull back, and Vincent would feast on the scraps. He closed his eyes, Clara's face flashing behind his lids, her hands on Daniel's arm, her voice steady with accusation. Better than you. The boy's face followed, a mirror he couldn't unsee. Edward had built his life on the belief that success erased the past, that money and power were honor enough. But now, with the world peering through the cracks, that belief felt hollow. He wasn't a father. Not to Daniel. Not to anyone. He'd made sure of that. So why did the thought of that boy, hooked to machines, twist something deep inside him? The gala's music drifted out, a waltz mocking his solitude. He straightened, smoothing his jacket, and glanced at his reflection in the glass door. The man staring back was still Edward Langston, sharp, composed, a titan. But the lines around his eyes seemed deeper, the gray at his temples more pronounced. He'd told Clara this wasn't his burden, but the weight pressed harder with every whisper. Back inside, he rejoined the crowd, nodding to a senator who clapped his shoulder, deflecting a reporter's probing smile. Vincent lingered near the bar, watching like a vulture, but Edward didn't give him the satisfaction of a glance. He'd handle this his way, quietly, methodically. A call to legal in the morning, a statement to the press, a donation to silence the hospital. The story would die, and he'd stand taller for it. But as he lifted a glass of water to his lips, bourbon abandoned again, he caught Vincent's voice one last time, a murmur to a companion. "Let's see how long he lasts." Edward swallowed, the water tasteless, and set the glass down with a soft clink. The lights of the gala burned bright, but the whispers beneath them grew louder, threading through the cracks in his armor. For the first time in years, Edward Langston felt the ground shift beneath his feet, and he wasn't sure he could stop it. Edward Langston stood in the dim glow of the company's archive room, a cavern of steel shelves buried beneath Langston, Innovation's gleaming headquarters. The gala's echoes still clung to him, the whispers, Vincent's taunts, the weight of 1,000 eyes, but he'd come here to silence them. Control demanded action, and action meant answers. Margaret had pulled strings to get him access after hours, her quiet efficiency a lifeline he didn't acknowledge aloud. He needed proof, something to bury this scandal before it buried him. The air smelled of dust and old paper, a stark contrast to the sterile polish of his office. He traced a finger along the labeled boxes, contracts, patents, tax records, until he found one marked Personal Correspondence, 1990s. His hand hesitated, the cardboard rough under his touch. He hadn't kept personal files back then, not after Sacramento. But Clara's words gnawed at him. "I tried." If she'd reached out, if there'd been letters, they'd be here, intercepted, by his first assistant, a woman he'd paid well to filter out distractions. He pried the lid open, revealing a stack of envelopes yellowed by time. Most were mundane, thank you notes, invitations, but one caught his eye. A small, plain envelope with Clara's tight, careful script. Edward Langston, C.O. Langston Enterprises. The postmark read Sacramento, April 1995. His breath hitched. Daniel would have been a baby then. He tore it open, the paper brittle in his hands. Inside was a photo, a chubby infant with dark curls, cradled in Clara's arms. She looked tired but defiant, her smile faint against the backdrop of a cramped apartment. A note was tucked behind it, her handwriting steady. "This is Daniel, your son. He was born last month. I don't want your money, Edward. I just want him to know you exist. Please write back." Edward's chest tightened, a vice squeezing the air from his lungs. He flipped through the box, more letters, one for every year. Daniel's first steps today. He asked about his dad. He's 5 now and I don't know what to tell him. The final one, dated 10 years ago, was the shortest. Daniel's growing up strong. I won't beg you anymore, but he deserves better than silence. No photo this time, just her signature, a full stop to her pleas. Edward sank onto a metal chair, the box spilling across the table. 30 letters, maybe more, all unopened, all unseen. He hadn't just walked away from Clara, he'd erased her, erased Daniel, with the cold precision of a man who refused to be tethered. His mind raced back to those early days. He'd been a nobody then, scraping by in a rented office. His first, big deal dangling like a lifeline. Clara had called once, twice. He remembered the phone ringing, her voice faint through the static. He'd told his assistant, "No personal calls, I'm busy." And that was that. He'd assumed she'd given up, moved on. But she hadn't. She'd written year after year, and he'd built a wall to keep her out. The photo of Daniel stared, up at him, those infant eyes piercing through the decades. Edward pressed a hand to his forehead, the room spinning. He'd prided himself on discipline, on the ability to cut away anything that didn't serve his ambition. Honor to him was success, power, the name Langston etched in gold, but this was cowardice dressed as strength. He hadn't ignored Clara out of ignorance. He'd done it deliberately, a choice to bury the past so deep it couldn't touch him. He stood, pacing to the narrow window overlooking the bay. The river Hudson flowed beyond, its surface a dark ribbon under the city's lights. He'd stood here 1,000 times, gazing out at his kingdom, but tonight, it felt foreign. The man who'd built this empire wasn't the titan he'd imagined. He was a shadow, running from a woman's courage and a child's existence. Clara hadn't begged for money or pity. She'd asked for recognition for Daniel, and he'd denied her even that. His phone buzzed. Margaret, no doubt, with updates on the stock slide or Vincent's next move. He silenced it, letting the quiet settle. The letters lay scattered. A timeline of his absence. He picked up one from Daniel's 10th birthday. He made a card for you today. I told him you're busy. He said he'd wait. Edward's throat burned, but he swallowed it down. No tears. No weakness. That was his rule. Yet his hand trembled as he set the letter aside, the weight of those words heavier than any boardroom defeat. He could still fix this. Burn the letters, deny the story, let Vincent's venom fizzle out. The press would move on, the board would stabilize, and Daniel would fade back into the ether. But as he reached for the box, his reflection caught in the window. Sharp jaw, graying hair, eyes that mirrored the boy on that hospital bed. He froze. Running had been easy once. It wasn't anymore. The archive room's hum filled the silence, a mechanical heartbeat mocking his own. Edward gathered the letters, stacking them with care, and slipped the photo into his pocket. He wouldn't burn them. Not yet. But he wouldn't face them either. He left the room, the door clicking shut behind him, and stepped into the elevator. The ride down was a descent into something he couldn't name. Guilt, perhaps, or the first stirrings of a conscience he'd long suppressed. Outside, he walked to the river's edge, the wind sharp against his face. The Hudson flowed on, steady and unyielding, a witness to his triumphs and his shame. He pulled the photo out, studying Daniel's tiny features. "I'm not your father," he whispered, testing the lie. It tasted bitter, hollow. For the first time in years, Edward Langston felt small, not before the world, but before a truth he couldn't outrun. The lights of the city flickered, but the river held its secrets close, and so did he. Edward Langston's office felt like a fortress under siege. The glass walls that once framed his dominion over San Francisco now reflected a storm he couldn't contain. The morning after the archive room, the headlines had sharpened their teeth. Langston's secret son, a tale of abandonment? The stock ticker on his desk blinked relentlessly, down 8%, then 10. The board was in chaos, emails piling up like accusations. He sat at his desk, hands steepled, staring at the photo of Daniel still tucked in his pocket. Clara's letters haunted him, but he'd locked them away in his safe, a temporary burial for a past he wasn't ready to face. Margaret entered, her tablet glowing with fresh damage. "Vincent Pierce is at it again," she said, her voice clipped. "He's leaked a document, claims it's proof you paid Clara off to keep quiet. The press is eating it up." Edward's eyes narrowed. He took the tablet, scanning the forgery. A grainy scan of a supposed contract, his signature scrawled at the bottom, dated 1995. A lie. Blatant and bold. "This is fabricated," he said, his tone flat but edged with steel. "Vincent's desperate. He's got nothing real to throw." Margaret nodded, but her gaze lingered. "The board doesn't care if it's real. They want a statement. Now." He waved her off, turning to the window. The bay sprawled below, its waves glinting like knives. Vincent was a vulture, circling for weakness, and this was his sharpest strike yet. Edward could crush it. Legal could disprove the document in hours. A countersuit would bury Vincent in litigation. But the truth beneath the lie gnawed at him. He hadn't paid Clara off, but he'd silenced her all the same, with indifference instead of cash. The distinction felt thinner than ever. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Langston, there's a Clara Carter here to see you," the receptionist said. Tentative. Edward froze, his hand hovering over the button. Clara? Here? In his world? He pressed it down, voice steady. "Send her up." She stepped into the office minutes later, a figure out of place against the sleek glass and chrome. Her nurses, scrubs were wrinkled, her face etched with exhaustion, but her eyes burned with the same fire he'd seen in Sacramento. She carried a worn tote bag, her knuckles white around the straps. "Edward," she said, her voice a quiet thunder, "I need your help." He stood, gesturing to a chair, but she didn't sit. I don't have time for games, Clara, he said, keeping his tone even. If this is about money, it's not. She cut him off, stepping closer. It's about Daniel. The press is calling him a liar, a gold digger. They're saying I sold him out for your fortune. He's awake now, Edward. He hears it all. I need you to tell the truth for him. Edward's jaw tightened. Awake. Daniel was awake. The boy, who'd lain silent, a ghost of his own making, now had a voice. And it was drowning in the mess Edward had left behind. The truth? He said, his words measured. You want me to admit to something I didn't know? To ruin everything I've built? Clara's eyes softened, but her resolve didn't waver. You knew enough to walk away. I'm not asking for your empire. I'm asking for his dignity. He's your son, Edward, whether you claim him or not. The word son hung between them, a weight he couldn't shrug off. He turned to the window, hands clasped behind his back, forcing calm into his posture. I can't do that, Clara. Not now. The company's on the edge. One wrong move, and it's over. She stepped beside him, her reflection faint in the glass. You think this is about your company? It's about you, Edward. Who you are when the lights go out. I've held Daniel together for 28 years. I've lied to him, told him. You were too busy to care, but he's not a child anymore, and he's breaking under this. Her voice cracked, and Edward caught the sound of it. A cough, faint but ragged, buried in her throat. He turned, studying her. The lines on her face were deeper than he'd noticed, her breathing shallow. You're sick, he said, not a question. Clara straightened, brushing it off. It's nothing. Old lungs, long shifts. Don't change the subject. But he saw it now. The toll of those years, the weight she'd carried alone. His mind flashed to the letters. Daniels, growing up strong. She'd written that while fighting her own battles, while he'd signed deals in boardrooms like this one. He'd thought her weak once, a tether he'd cut to free himself. Now she stood here, stronger than he'd ever been, and it shamed him. I'll handle Vincent, he said finally, his voice low. I'll kill the story, but I won't go public with this. Not yet. Clara's shoulders sagged, but she nodded. Do what you have to. Just don't let him pay for your silence. Again. She turned to leave, then paused, her cough breaking the quiet, a dry, hacking sound that lingered as she walked out. Edward stood alone, the office vast and empty around him. He sank into his chair, the tablet still glowing with Vincent's lie. He could disprove it, yes. But the real truth, the one Clara carried, was heavier. Daniel awake, hearing the world, call him a fraud. Clara sick, still fighting. And Edward, perched atop his empire, unable to move without cracking the facade he'd built. He opened his desk drawer, pulling out the bourbon flask he kept there. The silver caught the light, tempting him to drown the noise. But he set it aside unopened and reached for his phone instead. Margaret, he said when she answered. Get legal on that document, full priority, and find out what's wrong with Clara Carter, discreetly. He hung up, staring at the bay. The river beyond flowed on, its currents hidden beneath a calm surface. Edward's hands rested on the desk, steady, but inside the fissures widened. Vincent's forgery was a cheap shot, but Clara's plea was a blade to the heart. For the first time, Edward Langston felt the weight of truth, not the world's but his own, and he wasn't sure he could bear it. Edward Langston drove back to Sacramento under a sky heavy with clouds, the weight of Clara's plea pressing against his ribs. The city blurred past, neon signs, tired storefronts, a world he'd left behind but couldn't outrun. He'd told himself this trip was strategy. See Daniel, assess the damage, and silence the story with cold, hard facts. Legal was dismantling Vincent's forgery. The press would tire soon enough. But as the hospital loomed ahead, its brick facade stark against the gray, he knew this wasn't just about control anymore. It was about the boy, his boy, who'd woken up to a world tearing him apart. The ICU was quieter this time, the beep of machines a steady pulse. Edward stepped into Daniel's room, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum. Clara sat by the bed, her face drawn, a cup of cold coffee cradled in her hands. Daniel was awake, propped against pillows, his eyes, Edward's eyes, fixed on the ceiling. Bandages wrapped his chest, a brace held his neck, but his jaw was set, a mirror of the defiance Edward knew too well. He didn't look at Edward, not yet. Clara stood, her cough rattling faintly. "He's been asking about you," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I told him you'd come." Edward nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "How is he?" "Alive." Daniel answered for himself, his voice rough like gravel underfoot. He turned his head slowly, wincing, and met Edward's gaze. "You're the guy from the news, the big shot who doesn't want me." The words cut, sharp and deliberate, but Edward didn't flinch. He'd faced worse in boardrooms, hostile takeovers, betrayal, and never blinked. "I'm here now," he said, his tone even. "That's what matters." Daniel's laugh was bitter, cut short by a grimace of pain. "Yeah, sure. Here to save your stock, right? Mom says you're my dad. I say you're just a name on a paper I found in her drawer." Edward's chest tightened, but he held his ground. He glanced at Clara, searching for an anchor, and she nodded toward a chair. He sat, the plastic creaking under his weight, and studied Daniel. The boy's face was his own, younger, softer, but unmistakably his. The letters flashed in his mind. He's growing up strong. Strong, yes, but broken now, and Edward felt the fault line of that fracture tracing back to him. "I didn't know about you," Edward said, choosing his words like steps on thin ice. "Not until now. I'm not here to excuse that. I'm here to fix what I can." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Fix me? I don't remember much. Car crash, lights, pain. But I remember the news. They say I'm a scam. Mom's a liar. You gonna fix that with your money?" Before Edward could respond, Clara stepped in, her voice steady despite the strain. "Daniel, stop. He's not the enemy. Not today." She turned to Edward, her gaze piercing. "Tell him the truth, Edward. All of it." He hesitated, the weight of her letters pressing against him. The truth, all of it, meant admitting he'd chosen silence, that he'd built an empire while she'd built a life. But before he could speak, Clara reached into her tote bag and pulled out a folder, its edges worn. She handed it to him, her hands trembling slightly. "This is the truth I've carried. Open it." Edward took it, his fingers brushing hers, rough, warm, a contrast to his own manicured calm. Inside was a stack of documents, stock certificates, small but significant, in Langston Innovations. His breath caught. They were dated years ago, purchased in Daniel's name. A note was clipped to the top, Clara's handwriting again. "For Daniel's future, from the only thing I could give, my savings. I believed in you, Edward, even when you didn't." He looked up, stunned. "You bought shares? With what?" "Every extra dime," she said, her voice breaking. "Night shifts, skipped meals, anything I could scrape together. I thought one day you'd see him, see us, and it'd mean something. It was my way of keeping you in his life, even if you didn't know." The room spun. Edward gripped the folder, the paper crinkling under his fingers. Clara, who'd begged him to stay, who'd written letters he'd never read, had invested in his dream, not for herself but for Daniel. She'd tied her son to him with the only thread she could afford, while he'd spent those years signing billion-dollar deals, blind to her sacrifice. His throat burned, but he swallowed it, keeping his face still. Control. He couldn't lose it now. Daniel watched him, his eyes sharp despite the haze of painkillers. "So what? She bet on you and you still left. Why should I care?" Edward met his gaze, steady. "You shouldn't. Not about me. But your mother. She's worth caring about. She gave you everything I didn't." Clara coughed again, deeper this time, and Edward saw the flicker of worry in Daniel's face. He stood, stepping closer to the bed. "I don't know you, Daniel," he said, his voice low but firm. I don't know how to be your father. But I'm here now and I'll make this right. Not for me, not for the company, but for you. Daniel looked away, his jaw tight, but he didn't argue. Clara touched Edward's arm, a fleeting gesture, and whispered, "Thank you." Her cough followed her out as she stepped into the hall, leaving Edward alone with his son. He sat again, the folder heavy in his lap. The boy's breathing filled the silence, a rhythm Edward couldn't match. He'd come to fix a problem, to protect his name, but Clara's sacrifice had shifted the ground beneath him. She'd believed in him. Him, the man who'd walked away. And that faith was a mirror he couldn't look away from. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and murmured, "I don't deserve to be your father. Not yet." Daniel didn't respond, but his eyes flicked to Edward, a crack in the wall. Outside, the clouds broke, rain tapping against the window like a quiet confession. Edward stayed, the folder a lifeline he hadn't earned, and for the first time he felt the pull of something stronger than control, something that might, just might, be worth fighting for. Edward Langston stood in the shadow of his own empire, the press conference room at Langston Innovations a crucible of light and noise. The walls gleamed with chrome, the podium a stark island under blazing spotlights. Reporters packed the space, their cameras flashing like gunfire, their murmurs a rising tide. Vincent Pierce had orchestrated this moment, a final blow to topple Edward's reign. The forged contract had been debunked, legal had shredded it in hours, but Vincent had pivoted, leaking hospital records, twisting Daniel's existence into a weapon. "Langston's bastard threatens tech giant's future," the latest headline screamed. Edward's hands tightened behind his back, but his face remained a mask of calm. This was his stand, and he wouldn't falter. Vincent strode in first, his smirk a blade honed for the kill. He took the stage, his voice booming through the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to unmask a fraud. Edward Langston's built his fortune on a lie, a family abandoned, a son left to die. I've got the proof." He waved a stack of papers, medical bills, grainy photos of Daniel's crash, his eyes glinting as the crowd leaned in. "This isn't about business anymore. It's about honor, or the lack of it." The room erupted, questions flying like shrapnel. "Is it true, Mr. Pierce? What does this mean for Langston Innovations?" Vincent basked in it, a predator in his element, but Edward didn't move. He'd faced Vincent's kind before. Ambition, wrapped in venom, and won. Yet this wasn't about winning now. It was about Daniel, about Clara, about the man he'd failed to be. The folder of stock certificates burned in his memory, Clara's quiet faith a weight he couldn't shake. He stepped forward, the crowd hushing as he approached the podium. Vincent sneered, stepping aside with mock deference. "Your turn, Edward. Tell them how you'll buy your way out of this one." Edward adjusted the mic, his movements deliberate, his gaze sweeping the room. Flashbulbs popped, but he didn't blink. "I'm not here to buy anything," he said, his voice low, steady, cutting through the chaos. "I'm here to tell you the truth." A ripple of anticipation swept the crowd. He took a breath, the air thick with expectation, and began. "Vincent Pierce wants you to believe I'm a man without honor. He's half right. 30 years ago, I walked away from a woman who loved me, Clara Carter. I didn't know she was pregnant. I didn't want to know. I built this company on that choice, on the belief that success was enough. I was wrong." The room stilled, the silence a vacuum sucking the air from his lungs. Vincent's smirk faltered, but Edward pressed on. "Daniel Carter is my son. He's lying in a hospital bed right now, fighting to live, while men like Vincent turn his pain into a headline. I didn't pay Clara to hide him. I ignored her year after year because I was too afraid to face what I'd left behind. That's my failure, not hers, not his." A reporter shouted, "Why admit this now? Damage control?" Others chimed in, their voices a clamor of doubt. Edward raised a hand, silencing them, his calm unshaken. "No. I'm admitting it because Daniel deserves better than lies, because Clara deserves better than silence. I've spent my life chasing power, thinking it was honor, but real honor isn't this. He gestured to the room, the lights, the empire. It's standing up, for what's right, even when it costs you everything. Vincent laughed, a harsh bark. Noble words, Edward. But your board won't buy it. Your investors won't. You're finished. Edward turned to him, eyes cold but steady. Maybe. But I'm not here for them, Vincent. I'm here for my son. You can have your victory. Choke on it if you want. I've got something worth more. He faced the crowd again, his voice rising just enough to carry. Effective immediately, I'm stepping down as CEO of Langston Innovations. The board can choose my successor. I've given this company 30 years, but I owe Daniel more. I owe Clara more. That's all I have to say. The room exploded. Shouts, gasps, the clatter of cameras, but Edward didn't waver. He stepped back, leaving the podium empty. Vincent's stunned silence a hollow triumph. Reporters surged forward, microphones thrusting, but Edward walked through them, his stride measured, his head high. A few jeered, calling him a coward, a failure. One woman in the back clapped, her hands trembling, tears in her eyes. He didn't stop to see who she was. Outside, the air hit him like a slap, sharp and cold. He stood on the steps, the city sprawling below, its lights a constellation of his past. His phone buzzed, Margaret no doubt, or the board in a panic, but he silenced it. The bourbon flask in his pocket felt heavy, a temptation he'd carried too long. He pulled it out, held it to the light, then dropped it into a trash bin with a dull clang. Control wasn't about resisting now, it was about choosing. Back in Sacramento, Clara watched the broadcast on a grainy hospital TV, Daniel beside her. She gripped his hand, her cough muffled by a tissue, and whispered, "He did it, Danny. He did it." Daniel's eyes, still sharp, still his father's, softened, a crack in his armor. "Yeah," he said, voice rough. "He's late, but he's here." Edward drove away from the city that night, the skyline shrinking in his rear view. The press would feast for weeks, his resignation a scandal, Vincent a temporary king. But he felt lighter than he had in years. He'd lost the empire, but not himself. The lights of San Francisco burned bright behind him, a fire he'd stoked and now released. Ahead lay Sacramento, a quieter glow, and a chance to rebuild something real. For the first time, Edward Langston didn't need to run. The Sacramento River flowed gentle and wide under the late afternoon sun, its surface a mirror for the sky's fading gold. Edward Langston stood on its bank, a fishing rod in his hands, the line dipping lazily into the water. Beside him, Daniel sat in a folding chair, his neck brace gone, replaced by a faint scar tracing his jaw. The boy, his son, was quieter now, the hospital a fading memory, but his eyes still held that sharp edge Edward knew from his own reflection. Clara's old cabin sat behind them, its weathered wood a testament to years survived, its porch sagging but sturdy. Edward had rented it back, a small act of reclamation, and moved in 2 months after the press conference that had shattered his empire. The city had howled when he'd walked away. Langston Innovations stumbled, then steadied under a new CEO, a younger, hungrier version of the man Edward had been. The headlines lingered for weeks. Langston's fall, a titan's retreat. But they'd faded, as all storms do. Vincent Pierce crowed victory for a while, his smug face plastered, across tech blogs, but even that had dulled. Edward didn't read the papers anymore. He didn't need to. The world he'd built was behind him, and what lay ahead was here, in the slow ripple of the river and the tentative bond he was forging with Daniel. "Fish aren't biting today," Daniel said, breaking the silence. His voice was stronger now, less rough, but it carried a trace of the bitterness Edward hadn't yet erased. "You sure you know what you're doing?" Edward chuckled, a sound he barely recognized. "Not a clue. Never fished before. Thought it'd be easier than running a company," Daniel snorted, adjusting his line. "Yeah, well, you sucked at that too, didn't you?" The jab stung, but Edward let it settle. He'd earned it. He cast his line again, the motion awkward but deliberate, and glanced at Daniel. "Maybe. But I'm here now. That's gotta count for something." Daniel didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the water. Edward waited, the quiet stretching between them like the river itself. He'd learned patience these past months. Learned it from Clara, who moved slower now, her cough a constant shadow. She'd refused his offer to pay for treatment at first, her pride as fierce as ever, but he'd worn her down with quiet insistence. Not charity, he'd said, but responsibility. She'd relented, and the doctors were hopeful, chronic, not terminal, if she rested. Rest wasn't her nature, but Edward made sure she had no choice, cooking dinners she grumbled about and fixing the cabin's leaks she'd ignored. Clara emerged from the cabin now, a blanket around her shoulders, her steps careful on the uneven ground. She carried a thermos of tea, the steam curling in the cool air, and handed it to Daniel. "Don't let him fool you," she said, nodding at Edward. "He's better at this than he lets on, just stubborn." "Runs in the family," Daniel muttered, but a faint smile tugged at his lips. Clara caught Edward's eye, her own smile soft, and he felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. She settled onto a bench nearby, watching them, her presence a steady anchor. They fished in silence for a while, the river's hum filling the gaps. Edward's thoughts drifted to the press conference, the lights, the chaos, the moment he'd let go. He'd expected ruin, but found freedom instead. The board had kept his shares intact, a gesture of respect or pity. He didn't care which. He'd sold half, funneling the money into a fund for families like Clara's, single parents, forgotten kids, second chances. It wasn't redemption, not fully, but it was a start. The rest he kept for Daniel, a legacy not of power, but of possibility. "You didn't have to quit," Daniel said suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. "The company, I mean. You could have fought Pierce, kept it all." Edward reeled in his line, empty again, and set the rod aside. "Maybe. But fighting Vincent wouldn't have changed what I did to you, to your mom. I spent 30 years building something I thought was honor. Turns out it was just a cage." Daniel looked at him then, really looked, his eyes searching. "So what's this? Guilt?" "No," Edward said, meeting his gaze. "It's a choice. I wasn't there when you needed me. I can't fix that. But I can be here now. That's all I've got." Daniel nodded, slow, like he was weighing the words. "Mom says you're not so bad, for a guy who ditched us." Clara laughed from the bench, a sound that broke into a cough, but carried light. "I said he's trying, Danny, give him that." "I am," Edward said, his voice low but firm. "Trying's all I've got left." Daniel didn't reply, but he cast his line again, the motion smoother this time. A fish tugged and he grinned, a quick unguarded flash that lit something in Edward's chest. They pulled it in together, a small trout flapping against the bank, and for a moment, the years between them shrank. As the sun dipped lower, Clara called them in for dinner. Edward helped Daniel fold the chairs, his son's arm stronger now, leaning less on him. Inside, the cabin smelled of stew, Clara's recipe, Edward's clumsy execution, and they sat around a table worn smooth by time. Daniel ate in silence, but his shoulders relaxed, and Clara's cough was softer, eased by the tea. Edward watched them, these two he'd lost and found, and felt the river's calm seep into him. Later, under a sky pricked with stars, Edward stood on the porch, the night air cool against his skin. Clara joined him, her blanket tight around her. "You don't need to prove anything anymore," she said, her voice a whisper. "You're here. That's enough." He looked at her, then at the river beyond. "I'm not proving, I'm learning. Took me too long, but I'm here." She smiled, faint but real, and went inside. Edward stayed, the water's murmur a quiet hymn. He'd left a titan's life behind. Not easily, not cheaply, but what he'd gained was heavier, truer. Honor wasn't the lights of San Francisco, or the roar of a crowd. It was this, a river, a sun, a woman who'd never stopped believing, and for the first time, Edward Langston knew peace. Edward stood on the porch, the Sacramento River glinting under starlight. Clara's lantern glowed inside. Daniel's snores a soft rhythm. He'd left an empire for this. Family. Quiet. A chance. To be more. The river flowed on, steady and true, like the honor he'd found at last. Moved by Edward's story. Subscribe for more tales of courage, and like to keep the journey flowing.